I'm Joy Pullmann, and welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. Joining me today is my friend Matt Garnett. He is, and I'm gonna read this, but he's a friend of mine. He's the host of the In Layman's Terms podcast, as well as the Trucker Hacks podcast. And he's a husband of one beautiful wife and father of two beautiful kids. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So I had Matt join me today because I know this is one of his favorite topics. We're going to technically talk about the Nice White Parents podcast, #1 on Apple, hugely popular, put out by the same folks who put out the smash podcast hit Serial, and not Cereal, Serial. It kind of brought back really revived the podcast genre, the whole storytelling craze. And of course, everybody's stuck at home, so we're listening to a lot of stuff. But before we kind of get into that, we both have a lot of thoughts about that. I think that the 5th episode of that podcast just dropped, so I haven't listened to that yet.
Right.
Maybe we'll have to, after we listen to that, have a follow-up. We'll see. But before we get into that, Matt, I just wanted to hear about your life. Tell me what it's like being a trucker during a time of COVID.
Well, to be honest, I haven't noticed much difference. I'm still running as hard as I can. Steel still, what I run is steel mostly. Mm-hmm. And in the Midwest, the steel operation hasn't slowed down much. Now we've seen some of the rates drop and that sort of thing. So maybe we see fluctuations in our paycheck and that sort of thing. But as far as truckers go, I personally haven't noticed a whole lot, other than the fact that I can get through, say, Cincinnati or Chicago or some other major city without much, even Indianapolis. It's just the traffic has reduced. But other than that, we're still running pretty hard. And, I think it's just a matter of once this whole thing opens back up, then, us blue collar guys are going to throw you guys on our shoulders and everything's going to be fine. Yep. Going to carry you right through. It's not going to be a problem. So don't worry about it.
That's great to hear. I mean, because I hear a lot of people worrying about like supply chain problems, and we published an article from a fellow trucker who was talking about, some, for example, closures of, of the truck stops, people, and we're depending on people, to get ourselves our supplies, Amazon to our door. And, if they need to stop and take a bathroom break, I'd kind of like that to be available. Right. But, your face seems to be indicating to me not huge amount of problems that you're seeing, not a lot of disruptions, but maybe there's a little bit more hype than there is reality.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm absolutely certain some guys have experienced that where, there's some truck stops where they're used to stopping and shutting down, where they're closed. I know personally, there's certain truck stops where I'm able to go into a certain restaurant and order a hamburger or something like that, where now I have to walk around through their drive-thru and they look at me like, I'm crazy. And then they go, oh, okay, this is a trucker. Normally we don't do this, but let's go ahead and give him his hamburger for tonight or whatever. So some of that I've experienced for sure. And it is very strange to run through the heart of Chicago and, at rush hour times and not see rush hour traffic. That is very bizarre. Same thing with Cincinnati, even Indianapolis, Toledo area, Detroit, these sorts of things, where there's not the traffic you're normally accustomed to. But for the most part, I'm still making the income that I'm used to making. I'm aside from, walking into a truck stop and them going, hey, you got to go get your mask. Oh, okay, I'll go get my mask. And you get your mask and everything's fine. Aside from those sorts of inconveniences, we truckers are still doing our thing, which gives me confidence that, I still see, whatever the stock market climbing, there's a lot of confidence out there. And the thing of it is, supply chain things are an issue. I get that. But, me personally haven't experienced any of that. And like I say, I think at the end of the day, when this starts to wane off, you guys can just jump on our backs. We'll carry you through. Won't be a problem.
That's really hopeful because it's, people like me, white collar people. I mean, I've been working out of my office, for Since my oldest, about 8 years now. So I know,
Uh-huh.
really long time.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to kind of know. There's like the Twitter conversation that's full of craziness and speculation, and then there's
Yeah.
what you see in your everyday life. And for me,
Right.
I mean, we live in the Midwest. I live in normal person territory, not Twitter land, and the reality is so often so different from Twitter. So, but I'm not really in, the blue collar domain. And those are, like you say, those are the people we're relying on to get fed,
Yeah.
to get our plumbing,
Yeah.
and all the things we really need to stay alive and healthy.
Right.
We need
Right.
those folks. So that's good to hear from your
Right.
kind of perspective.
Right.
Let's
Well,
talk. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna say I'm 100% convinced, seeing the guys every do on a day-to-day basis, that you guys got nothing to worry about out there. Got nothing to worry about. It's
Thank
not
you.
gonna be a problem. Yeah.
So you and I are both, I was about to say we're both nice white parents, and I was like, I'm not sure if we're nice, first of all.
Right. I
And I
might be a
don't really
mean
like,
white parent. Right.
yeah. And I also don't really like the designation white, because I'm like,
Yeah.
well, for one thing, I'm kind of a peachy pale pink.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
white to me implies paper, and then it also does that thing of like grouping all the people of every, like it pretends that, it's kind of, they have the same problem with all kinds of racial, just different designations, but it's so broad. Like my ancestry is Polish and a bit of German, and that's not the same. That's not the same like culture background as someone who's Irish. I don't know. What are you, Matt? What's a Garnet?
Well, we're not sure about the Garnets.
Uh-huh.
We think we're French, but we're not
Uh-huh.
entirely sure.
Uh-huh.
But the better part, the overwhelming majority of my genetics is German.
Okay.
So for instance, my mother is 75% German, so that makes me somewhere between 50 and somewhere between
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
25%
Yeah.
German. And my grandfather was the son of an immigrant in the early 20th century, so the
Yeah, mine
1900s.
too.
Yep. So he immigrated here, and sad to say, my grandfather's dead. My great grandfather died when my grandfather was about age 12, and so
Mm-hmm.
he took over the farm.
Wow.
When he was at age 12, took over the family, went through the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the whole thing, and so here I am sitting today, and
Yeah.
my son and that sort of thing. So
And you're
so
being told that, you are responsible for slavery when none of your ancestors
right,
were here during slavery.
yeah.
That's,
So yeah.
yeah.
So it's strange, right? We
Uh-huh.
got I would say extremely lucky in a lot of senses, because my ancestors immigrated here in the early 20th century, and that was after
Uh-huh.
the Civil War.
Yeah.
So fortunately, my ancestors didn't have
Mine
to
too.
participate.
Mine were probably serfs, actually, so they're probably basically the European equivalent of slaves. They're like poor Polish
Yeah,
farmers.
yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, my ancestors got out of Germany before
Oh,
the Third
sure.
Reich took over.
Sure.
You know,
Uh-huh.
so just very, very
So if you
lucky
just say the
that we
word white, just putting you in
yeah,
that box is kind of like the same as putting
yeah,
someone in the box of like black or brown. Calling
yeah,
someone black, you're like, well, you could have, be maybe a slave descendant from America, or you could be a slave descendant from the continent of Africa.
right,
You could be you could be a Nigerian, you could be a Jamaican, you could be from the Caribbean. There's so many, different black, all of these designations are somewhat artificial. So it's anyway. So maybe you start to feel like, oh, now I get, why it bothers people just to be lumped into this bucket. I'm the white
yeah,
bucket, just because people look at me and they say you're A, B, or C, and therefore. So I think actually this podcast really engages in a huge amount of stereotyping. And that was one of the things. So I have a couple of quotes here to discuss, but one of the fascinating things about listening to it is how it seems that, a lot of the fallacies and a lot of the ways of treating people that we are told never to do with people who have more melanin, let's say, black or brown, whatever people, whatever terms they use. So have been instructed not to talk about people in ways that this whole podcast completely applies to white people.
right,
Like you've got the
right,
stereotypes, you've got the grouping, you've got like casting negative aspersions I mean, all kinds of stuff like that going on. And it's really eerie to hear people who say that, would say I'm being anti-racist, or I'm, fighting racism, or, the reporter who's putting together this story, Hannah Jaffa Walt, she, she's obviously trying to address, she says several times, I'm trying to address unconscious bias, but by being blithely oblivious to the fact that she's doing exactly all these things, but just switching her preferred racial group, or the people she's treating. And I don't really think, switching discrimination or switching your bias is necessarily the goal here. I think it should be, treating people equally, and treating them as human beings, the same, regardless of what they look like or where they come from.
Right, right. Well, and this is my impression throughout this podcast series. And again, the fifth one just dropped, and I'm anxious to listen to it. But listening through the first four, what just grated against me was I felt like she was trying to put Band-Aids on a broken leg. Through this whole thing, where she talked about, okay, these schools and this situation, never addressed this or that or the other topic, when she never really talked about the root cause of the issue, which is what was going on in the homes of these children.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's really what I felt like she missed the entire time. And so when she got to episode 4 and she started talking about charter schools and how, all the kids are very, they're trained to sit on the floor, with their legs crossed and their hands folded, and they're in these uniforms and everything.
Controlling black and brown bodies, Yeah.
Right, 100%. Well, what's going on there? Well, what's been relegated to these schools is parenting.
Right.
That's what's been relegated to them. Okay, so if you're going to relegate parenting to schools, then they're going to have to do these sorts of kind of, militaristic, maybe, but you might call them, totalitarian type of measure, totalitarian. Well, if you're going to relegate.
So let me give a recap for the audience, whether they have or haven't listened to. So the podcast kind of goes through, she's following through kind of history, the story of this one, or a couple of schools in New York City. And, one of the main ones is a predominantly black and minority kids school. That has been integrated before, and then saw a resurgence in white families, more recently. And then in episode 4, she compares it to this charter school, and charter school is like an independently run public school. And Success Academy is notorious. Just really, it's generated a lot of headlines across the country. And they are very, very strict. So they basically have they force kids to do something called tracking, so they teach the kids explicitly, you need to have your eyes on the teacher while the teacher is teaching, and if they reprimand you, say, hey, tracking, Jody or whatever, that means put your eyes up here, because your eyeballs are basically forcing you to listen and learn. If you're looking over there, you're more likely, to be goofing off with your little friend. Anyway, so one of the complaints, especially among upper class and maybe white people, is the fact that these schools are extremely restrictive. But the thing that I think you're pointing out that they often ignore is that these schools are imposing an order that's often lacking from these kids' communities and their homes.
Yes,
so, like,
100%.
for example, in a well-ordered family, you have a mom and a dad from the time the kid is born working to say, Johnny, you can't hit and scream. And if you hit and scream, I mean, like I was talking with my friend the other day who has a little boy who is, he's a little boy, very rambunctious. And we're sharing some of the techniques we've used with our rambunctious little boys that include giving them a big bear hug until they stop a tantrum, I had a toddler. I had to carry him up to his bed every single day for months because he's kicking me, screaming, throwing a tantrum. I'm putting him on timeout. It was terrible, So the point being, if you have a well-ordered home, people paying, you have two parents, so you can focus your attention on parenting. So mom is actually, or dad is present in the home. They're doing that. They're holding the kid who's fighting and screaming. They're taking the kid up to the timeout. They're not putting up with baloney. But if that is breaking down, and we just published an article in the Federalist talking about a new Senate report that shows the massive increase in fatherlessness among Americans of all kinds. But it's especially concentrated. It's really, really large among Americans of all races now. But it's at the highest levels among particularly African American kids and then second Hispanic kids. But it's at crisis levels for everybody, our whole nation. Anyway, but so we are at crisis levels with kids upbringing because the lack of, committed 2-parent stable families for those kids, and they are not getting that support that they need to have a parent lock in on them and say, you are going to do this and I'm going to help you do it come hell or high water. So the schools are left to do that. The schools are stepping into these chaotic neighborhoods where there's huge amounts of unparented children, whether, through fault of parents or through, accidental, whatever. That's just the case. You have concentrations of kids from broken homes. And, so the parents are either unwilling or unable to provide parenting to their kids. And now the schools have to do it.
Right.
But
right.
in this podcast, all of that is completely glossed over. And then all of the blame is just put straight onto white parents. It's white parents' fault that, actually, I just had a thought, I was just about to say it's white parents' fault, that, some kids don't have a parent. I was like, well, I don't know if I would say it's white parents' fault, but it definitely is the wealthy upper class of America who have watched the destruction of the family happen and not said a word about it.
Yep.
And I do think there is blame to be had there. I wouldn't call it racial blame, but I think it's fair to assign it on class lines, at least somewhat.
Yeah. Well, right. And that's where, one of the segments of the fourth podcast I found particularly striking and troubling was one black man who talked about how the school is the parent to my children now.
Mm-hmm. He just openly said that.
Yeah. And in a sense, he seemed okay with that. But that's where the rubber meets the road. Mm-hmm. Is these charter schools are stepping in and saying, hey, these kids aren't being parented properly, so we have to incorporate that into our system of education.
They have to kind of go overboard.
Exactly.
My child necessary to us. I actually would consider it, but it's not quite as necessary for my kids to be put, they have literal, lines of tape put down the hallways to show the kids where to walk. Right. They tell those kids, pay attention to me, lock your eyes with me. They have, and I do think a lot of those are helpful, but I don't think it, because, my husband and I are very involved in our kids' lives and they have a lot of those skills from their family. I don't think they need a school that provides those skills because my kids already have them. But so it's kind of a different tool for a different family situation. I don't think there's any shame in reaching out and saying, hey, this is missing. I'm supplying it for my kid by partnering with the school to provide what my child needs.
Right, 100%. Well, and that's the thing is you mentioned illegitimacy rate. In the major cities across the United States, the illegitimacy rate is 90%. Yeah. New York, Chicago, LA, that's across all racial groups. Yeah. 90%. 90% of children are born without a mother and a father. That's a problem.
Horrifying. Right.
Yeah. And so these charter schools are coming in and saying, okay, we've got this problem. We have no idea.
Give you a daddy.
No, we can't get. But here's what we're going to do.
We can teach you some skills that a daddy would impart.
100%. And what's the result of these charter schools? They're passing the tests.
Yeah.
The children are reading at a higher rate. They're proficient in math.
Yeah.
They go to college. And so
they become contributing citizens. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what was utterly astonishing about this podcast was this woman, while she somewhat pointed that out, she just kind of glosses over that and says, oh, well, that's really not the solution to any of it.
Right.
I'm going, wait, what? These children are.
Or she sits there and like trivializes, controlling brown kids' bodies. I'm like, I control my kids' bodies. I don't care what they look like. You know what I mean? Like we all have to control our bodies. I have to keep my body from hitting into yours. I have to keep my mouth from screaming when I'm really angry. These are basic human skills. Controlling your body is like one of the first ones you have to learn. So her like condescension about that. When that spreads, what that really does is just keep, kids who need stability, who need explicit instruction. It keeps them uncontrolled. It keeps them from lacking the self-control that is going to be their only ticket to having a life worth living, which is really, really sad. It's really paternalistic, obnoxious.
Yeah. And that's where that's what's frustrating about the whole thing is, so when she talks about whiteness
Mm-hmm.
and blackness, so she is in some senses talking about the color of the skin, the body.
Mm-hmm.
But what people have to understand is when folks like this talk about whiteness and blackness, they're not just talking about the body. They're talking about ideology. They're talking about ideology.
They have seen, and that, yeah, I'll let you continue here. You're hitting on a really important note. But it's kind of like they have seized, they pull to themselves the power to define what it means to be black or white. So even if you are an African American, if you don't act X way, you're not really black. If you
100%.
Even if you're a Caucasian, a person of European ancestry, whatever terms we're using, if you don't act in a certain way, you're not really white. Like they're actually abstract concepts to people. You can okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and
it's a power play right there.
and our one of the candidates for our presidential race let that cat out of the bag not too many months ago.
Right.
You ain't voting for me, you ain't black.
Right. Yeah, right.
Right.
For those who don't pay attention to politics, that's a quote from Joe Biden.
Yeah. So I mean, so here's the thing.
He grabbed to himself the power to determine what it means to be a black American, which so many layers are problematic there.
Yeah. So you take a man like Clarence Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
He's not black.
Right. Descendant of slaves, grew up, impoverished, just like Jim Crow South, with his mom, in the black person section of Atlanta, literally, where they lived over open pools of human feces, because of racial discrimination. He's defined out of being black. Anyway, sick.
Right.
Sick.
Right. And and this relates to, so we hear these terms thrown around like Marxism or neo-Marxism or that sort of thing. But while folks of our kind of political bent will throw these terms around, kind of, they're Marxist or they're communist or whatever, without really explaining what's going on. If you compare, blackness and whiteness in those ideological terms to Marx and Engels Communist Manifesto, you've got the proletariat and you've got the bourgeoisie. Okay, so Clarence Thomas is bourgeoisie. He's white.
Right.
The proletariat is the black, so on and so forth. That's where those terms link up, and that's where you get this whole idea.
Like communist frame of the world, but they apply it to race.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
They make the categories racial categories, whereas Marx made it economic categories, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right. And at the end of the day, really what's being sought for here? Do we really want to raise people up, or do we want to bring people down? And that's, and if you look, and if you read, Road to
Serfdom.
Exactly. That's,
Say Hayek, folks, if you want to look it up. Short book, good read.
Yep, 100%. What is this revolutionary upsurge? Are they looking to raise people up? Or are they really looking to bring everybody down? In other words, do they feel compassion for those who are downtrodden and want to lift them up? Or do they feel
weaponizing compassion for some other aim?
Are they are they envious of those who have and want to bring them down? That's where the danger lies.
Oh, and there's so much envy going on in these podcasts. I kind of feel like part of the whole project of the podcast is to create envy and weaponize it and amplify it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just listen to it, you can hear that people, just because someone looks a certain way or has a certain income or family background, that for them will legitimize having resentment against them.
Right.
Which I think is envy is a moral evil. It's one of maybe one of the chief, favorite American sins, and but that is very, very dangerous when it's applied politically like this. One thing I wanted to do was I took a couple of quotes from the transcript of this article, and I want to read them I'm gonna read them and then just switch the racial terms in them, because so It's really,
Good luck.
really awkward to listen when you do that. So, first of all, we have running throughout the piece, the opening of, the whole series basically says that Black people are not responsible for their own selves, for their own communities, for their own lives, but it encourages, minorities to blame white people as the source of their problems. So it's really disempowering and basically says, anything wrong with your life, blame it on white people and demand that they solve it, and you're kind of at the mercy of white people. You don't have any agency. So here's one quote that kind of, from the reporter on this, Hannah Jaffa Walt. If you want to understand what's wrong with our public education system, she says, you have to look at what is arguably the most powerful force in our schools, white parents. So again, not parents, which I would actually, if you get rid of the white, I would say parents are absolutely number one, determiner of their kids' success and outcomes. And I mean, here's another quote from her. Let's see. So she talks about, public schools, the great equalizer. But I've made my way through the history of one American public school, and from what I can see, white parents are standing in the way of achieving this vision. Our schools are not an equalizing force because white parents take them over and hoard resources. This is a direct quote. Now I'm just going to switch, just switch this. So imagine if she said, public school is the great equalizer, but I have made my way through the history of one modern American public school, and from what I can see, Black parents are standing in the way of achieving this vision. Our schools are not an equalizing force because Black parents take them over and hoard resources. If it's not okay to say that about Black parents, which I don't think it is, why is it okay to say that about white parents? We all know the answer, right?
Joy, you are a racist. You are a racist. You don't realize people, right? So the whole going narrative is, unless you have the power, you can't be racist. So Black people don't have power, so therefore they can't be racist. Okay, so
so since they have no moral agency or no moral worth, they aren't responsible for their own responses or behavior. They're just victims who are helpless, poor. Which again, that's paternal. I mean, I think that's a racist attitude right there.
100%. Well, that's right, and that is what is so. I mean, just across the board with all of these notions, but in this particular podcast, it was just so jaw-dropping. I mean, it was gut wrenching to hear her
straight out,
tokenize and paternalize and say, oh, these poor minorities have no power, and they have no agency, and they're not able to do X, Y, and Z. And
because
I'm going,
they don't have money also, right? And so she equates, and I'm sitting there thinking, you do not have to have power to influence your child's life. You don't have to have money to influence your child's life. Talk to your kid, read to your kid, show up for your kid. That doesn't require money.
Right.
100%. Library cards are free. Anybody can read to their kid. If you cannot read to your kid, which Ben Carson's mother could not read competently enough, so Ben Carson, Secretary of Health and Urban Development, he, world famous neurosurgeon, African American. His mother, single mom, again, poor neighborhood. She could not read her son's schoolwork. She pretended she could to get him to do more of it and to do it better. And she assigned him essays she couldn't read. So again, if you don't have to have money to get to your kid, get your kid access to something. But this whole Marxist interpretation sees the whole world in terms of money equals worth, which, you're not worth more or less because of your income. That's just ridiculous. Right. It should just be rejected instead of accepted and weaponized. I'm going to read another quote. These are I got a couple of these and I can't, they're insane. This time I'm just going to substitute Black for white, and you can just hear the grading.
Yep.
So she's talking about, she interviewed kids at the school. The name of the school is SIS. So she talks about how their parents' racism trickled down to the kids. The kids at SAS did talk about race immediately. In fall 2015, in the first few weeks of school, a senior named Kristen leaned over to her classmate Chris and mumbled, "There are a lot of Black kids in this school." Again, I'm switching from white to Black. And Chris says, "Oh yeah, a teacher warned me about that over the summer." Chris, and here's a quote from Chris. He told me, "Oh, there's going to be a lot of Black kids coming in, French Black kids from upper economic statuses, so be prepared for that." I'm switching it, but they said white.
Yeah.
Black, but just imagine saying, "Be prepared for the Black kids." Whoa.
Right. Right.
That's totally not okay. And I don't think it's okay for anybody, regardless of what you look like. And so
Yeah.
that kind of like reverse racism is just endemic throughout the whole thing, and it's extremely cringy. And the only reason I think that we don't cringe about it, it's okay to say about white people, is because it's okay to be racist against white people right now, among certain groups in the United States, certain groups of
Right.
people who are connected to NPR and the New York Times and other positions of cultural massive power.
Right. Well, and it's also important to keep in mind when folks talk about whiteness and blackness. Again, don't forget they're also talking about ideology, right? So it's not just that these kids with white bodies are coming into our school. They're the white ideology, the Western liberal capitalism is coming into our school.
Well, that's really interesting, because I happen to think that, most Americans, no matter what their color is, don't really know much about, Western history. They don't even, we're losing our grip on Western values.
Right.
I mean, for example, what are the cardinal virtues among the Greeks, right? It's courage, it's prudence. Great. I'm showing my own, ignorance.
Well, you're right. Yeah.
It's the ones that are related to the 7. I'm just gonna plead having a 3-month-old baby and not sleeping. I can't remember anything. Fortitude or courage is one of the chief ones for the ancient Greeks, as well as prudence, which is choosing the right time and the right place to do things. So they're basically very stern virtues that require self-control, that require a command of yourself and a certain self-possession, which, by the way, would contradict the idea of, never control anybody's bodies. You need to control your body in order to be an upstanding, virtuous human being. But anyway, my point there is, regardless of the color of their skin, I don't think a lot of we're really losing a lot of our knowledge and our cultural memory of, of history, of literature, of systems of government, and the moral virtues that used to be ascribed to our ways of life. So they might be afraid, the critical theorists who see white as a concept might say, oh, white equals bad because it includes, self-control and reason and analysis, that the Western tradition includes that, that would, that logic kind of disproves our points and makes us look really bad, and we can't combat it. So therefore we just don't want to engage with it, but I don't think, I just don't think it's really true that, somebody's 4th grade white kid is shock troops for Western culture. I wish maybe they were a little bit more.
Yeah, true enough. But here's the, again, you take the concept of Western democracy and freedom, or representative.
Right.
Yeah, the idea of self-government is that. And again, forgive me, I'm having a brain lapse here, but the whole notion that the people have to be governed by a higher power. We are endowed by who? God.
Our creator, right.
And
we're basically and that's actually the concept of natural rights, right? Or the founders set up a government that was supposed to be reflexive of a transcendent moral order that they did not create. They are just reflecting and respecting it. And that's actually why the country eliminated slavery, because it was a law out of sync with the natural order. It is wrong. It is true. Even if the law says slavery is okay, the moral law that is higher than the technical law written down says that is wrong and it's abomination. And that's why America, because of its reflection of natural law in Western civilization, had the moral resources to get rid of chattel slavery. We never would have done it without that. And now we're erasing, the concepts and the modes of life that give rise to our ability to be free, happy people.
Right.
And part of that project is people, the people, like who created this podcast.
Right. So that you bring me right to the place I wanted to go, because that's what disturbed me most about this podcast was, who are we, you, Joy Pullmann, white girl, me, Matthew Garnett, white boy, to say what's good and what's not?
Right.
Maybe.
Right. We should just shut up because we're white.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
because
the protests over the summer, people are told, shut up because you're white. Straight up. Kneel down. So bow to me because you're white.
So why isn't the gang drug culture in Southside Chicago just as good as Western freedom and democracy? Who are you to impose your morals on me? See, that's the problem. We've got to have something, a third party arbiter here.
Yes, something to
there has to be morals.
Our ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's
that
the thing
that we respect and reflect and refer back to and both defer to. Now we can argue about what that outside party, how it applies, but we both respect the fact that it's there. Otherwise we have anarchy. When we have literal anarchy right now.
And when you eliminate that, who's to say that a school where kids just show up and they goof off and they're riotous and they don't pay attention in class?
That's
who's
just
to say
their culture.
Yep.
That's literally what this patronizing white reporter said. But
yep.
I don't care if it's their culture. I mean, we have to be able to say it's a bad culture because what it does is leads to those kids not learning. And if those kids don't learn, if they don't govern themselves, if they don't have self-possession, they will never have a happy life. They will feel good when they're children, but when they are adults who can't get a good job, can't hold it down because they won't show up for work consistently, they don't have a good work ethic, they don't put other people's needs before their own, they're going to be a bad parent, a bad community member. And it is part of what adults in the community do is to teach those little baby barbarians and every single human, no matter what he looks like, starts out a barbarian. It's the job of adults like you and me to pass down to them, okay, here's what we do and here's why. You need to control your body. You need to control your tongue. You need to control your temper. You need to focus on that teacher and learn, because otherwise you're going to suck as an adult. And not have any sucky adults for my children.
Right, 100%. Well, and I love what you just said, because it's very value laden, and you can trace those values back to a source, which we call God. The thing of it is our podcast friend here speaks in very value laden terms, like white's bad and this is good, and but on what is she grounding her? Where is she grounding her values?
Oh, that's a why
should So she says, why should we accept your values? You should accept our values. And then we turn around and say, why should we accept your values when we have these values? And then that's where the division occurs. When we don't have a common set of, hey, this is what constitutes good and this is what constitutes bad, based on what somebody else has told us is good or bad, right?
And that's really the conflict in America right now. There are two completely different and unreconcilable visions for the good life. One of them says the good life reflects a moral order that we all have to respect. We all have to. There is a structure within the world that if you break the natural order, you're going to get some consequences that you won't like. You sow the wind, reap the whirlwind. And there's another one that says there is no right and wrong. Your values and my values doesn't matter. We can just live whatever way we want, and they're not one way of life is better than the other. And you can't; those two can't coexist peacefully. But I'm afraid that only the people, the forces of anarchy, are aware that they can't coexist peacefully. I worry about that the people who want there to be order in life and a respected mutual understanding for an understanding of the common good that Americans share. That we people who want that and maybe can't articulate that. We not only we don't understand always how. But we also aren't. I think a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the anarchists and the rioters are coming for us. And I think we're really it's an us versus them. What it seems right now is that only the forces of violence and anarchy are aware of that.
Well, and. So
one of us has to triumph, right?
Well, true.
I want it to be an ordered way of life that provides for a good future for all
Yeah.
Americans, no matter what they look like. Other
Right,
people want to
right.
create like this weird power, power mongery system where, if you have the right inborn attributes, that determines the political loot that you get. Scary.
Yeah, it is. And so I haven't got any further on this than to just understand it. Just to say, okay, I get where this is going, and it's not to a good place. And because I feel like that's what frustrates a lot of folks like you and I. It's politically conservative pundits, whoever else it might be, is they're like, that's crazy, that makes no sense, it doesn't, I can argue against this, I've got this. They don't care about that. Truth, fact, that's not a thing. That's not a thing to them.
They pointed out they discarded the truth. That's irrelevant to them. Yeah.
Right. What's important to them?
Says that it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right. 100%.
So you can debate them to the wall and logically disprove or logically prove that they're the real racists or whatever. And they don't care. They just keep going.
They don't care. Right. So here's how I like to put this is, so when we recite the meanings to the creed, we teach our children to say, this is most certainly true.
Yeah.
With this counterculture, what are you going to call it? This neo-Marxist, I mean, I call it probably even Rousseauian type of movement. Their statement at the end of whatever it is that they endorse is, this most certainly subverts. Does it subvert?
This most certainly grants me power. Honestly, that's just straight up. That's what Lucifer says.
Yeah.
Either if you don't believe, regardless of whether you believe in a real Satan or a real Lucifer, if you just, the Dante's Inferno, if you see him as a figurehead, the Satan figure is the one who says, this is what gives me power. I will do what I think gives me power.
Yeah.
So he's the force of anarchy, of chaos, whether you take that in a Jordan Peterson, analogy version, or you're like me, a Christian, and you think there really is, evil, legitimate moral evil. It's very clear, but like you said, the question is, what do we do about it?
Right. Well, that's the question. And that's, I don't have an answer to that, honestly.
I think a lot of people don't, obviously.
Right. The best I've been able to come up with is, hey, try to understand it. Try to get to a point where you say, okay, we have people saying there's no such thing as men and women anymore. What's going on there? Oh, does that subvert? Oh yeah, that subverts. Right. We want to have an
autonomous chaos. Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah. 100%. Right. So, that's kind of so at least I can understand. Okay, so you take the autonomous zone, in the Pacific North, these autonomous zones in the Pacific Northwest.
In Seattle,
what's going on there? What are they trying to do? They're trying to subvert. Okay, at least I can understand it.
So you're right. So first you have to identify,
Right.
You have to look at the field of battle and know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. But then I think, honestly, the next step is fighting. And like for all of you out there who are, I mean, we fight not against flesh and blood, but with truth, basically. I think one way that people can fight against it is our only alternative is people, to actually fighting with your fists is fighting with words. So we need to stand up and speak out and say the truth.
Well, right.
I believe that the West has good things to offer. I believe that children need to be taught to how to live in order, so that they can have a good life. And these are things that, it's created in this racial frame. Black parents totally agree with that. You talk, parents of every color, everyone with a child knows you have to order their little souls, and like the major task of being a parent and a human being is to work towards a more ordered soul. And we also know that communally what we want is a more ordered body politic, community and neighborhood. So work towards the forces of order. Be an agent of order, of speak the truth and do the right thing, and demand that other people also do the same, because we don't want to live in chaos. We don't want to live in an unordered, disordered society and family.
Right. Well, and I think that's absolutely correct, because, and I think that's where, even though we might understand where this kind of philosophy comes from and what its aims are, you're exactly right. The antidote to that is to speak the truth, because
do the right thing.
Yeah, and do the right thing, and continue to do the right thing, and that will, at the end of the day, that will prevail. Because again, you think about, what turned Russia, into this in towards socialism and communism. It was a small group of folks who took advantage of an opportunity. Right?
It's true.
Right.
The revolutionaries were a very small minority. They just happened,
100%.
they got themselves in the right place at the right time, and they ruined the lives of millions of people.
Right. And that's, where, so people think about Marxism. Well, you've got to add the Leninist part to it as well, because Marxist Leninists, Marx thought, the revolution would kind of come about naturally. This is all would transform into this Marxist utopia. Well, Lenin disagreed. He thought, we need to take it,
we need to light the match.
Yep. We need not let a good crisis go to waste, right? Have you heard this before? Okay, that's Marxist. That's Marxist Leninist. To say that, we've got to take this small group of people and take advantage of this very critical situation in order to transform. And the only thing that had to happen in Russia was for the people to stand up and say, no, y'all aren't doing this. And you're absolutely right. It just takes a few folks.
You're a bunch of paper tigers. There's like 3 of you.
Yep.
With a bunch of, cardboard cutouts, making yourself bigger on Twitter.
Right. Right. And a New York Times podcast, New York Times articles, whatever else. And all you folks have to do at Success Academy is say, hey, you know what? My kid passed the test. My kid can read.
My kid has a job. My kid went to college. My kid can 100%. Read.
Yep. That's right. And that's all it takes. And that's why I think our republic will survive. And I'm very hopeful. That enough people, across all socioeconomic lines, racial groups, whatever. I'm very hopeful that they see this, and that there's enough of it going on that when push comes to shove, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
That's a great moment. That's a great moment for me to thank Matt Garnett. He is the host of the In Layman's Terms podcast, as well as Trucker Hacks. A friend of mine, I'm Joy Pullmann, the executive editor of the Federalist, and perfectly fitting here is our closure slogan: be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.